Heartless bank manager shames an elderly man. Then Morgan Freeman delivers a lesson he'll never forget. Sir, maybe banking just isn't for you. I don't have time for this. If you can't figure out how to use an ATM. The words, harsh and contemptuous, broke through the quiet of the bank lobby. Consumers looked toward the cause of the disturbance. Walter Harris, a 75-year-old retired schoolteacher, was standing at the front desk, clutching his cane while his wrinkled hands tightened over a little stack of documents. His eyes, full of both serene dignity and uncertainty, locked with those of the guy below him. Stephen Whitmore, the bank manager, had a haughty attitude across the desk, his arms crossed as he tapped his pricey watch, as if every moment spent on Walter were a personal inconvenience. Little child nearby held Walter's hand, whispering, her startled eyes darting between the two men. "Grandpa, is everything okay?" Walter squeezed her conscientiously to reassure her, but on the inside, he seemed little. His whole life he had been serving others, guiding, mentoring young brains, and still in this instant, he was being handled as a weight. Stephen was unaware of what no one in that bank knew, that someone else was observing, a man who has personally witnessed much too much injustice during his lifetime, and today as well. He would not have stood for it. That man? Freeman Morgan, from who one should get respect. One for everyone, zero just for the rich. Allow me to see where we stand. Walter had not anticipated today being challenging. He had come to the bank to pay his expenses by withdrawing money from his pension account, a one-minute chore. He had to approach the counter, though, when the ATM broke down. That ought to have been simple. Now here he was, being spoken down to as though he were squandering everyone's time. Stephen let out a theatrical sigh. "Look," he continued, his voice laced with contempt, "maybe you should ask your granddaughter for help next time. These deals can be done online." A handful of patrons in the backdrop laughed, rippling through. Walter sensed his face getting warm. "I just need a bit of help," he added softly. "That's all." Stephen slanted over the counter and grinned. "And I simply need you to stop dragging my line." Walter's hand on his cane tightened. His lifetime has seen him be patient. He had never spoken up, never insisted on more than what was reasonable. Today, though, something was about to evolve. And it would begin with the methodical, slow sound of a coffee cup being laid down close by. A voice sliced through the tension, smooth, rich, and forceful without effort. "That's an interesting approach to handle a consumer right now." The air in the bank changed right away. Stephen's smile disappeared. Every client focused on the man who had just spoken. And standing there and observing everything happen was Morgan Freeman. Stephen Whitmore believed he had no touch. He felt nobody would question him. But today he was about to discover that your treatment of people determines your power, not your position. Additionally, Morgan Freeman, he was about to ensure this course of instruction lasted a lifetime. Whitmore Banking and Trust's lobby was exactly what one would have expected from a top financial institution. Shining flooring, plush leather chairs, and a subdued buzz of efficiency. Wealth permeated everything, in the elegant but understated clicks of high heels against polished marble, in the fitted clothes of executives, in the subtle aroma of costly perfume. Not every person here, though, fit the picture of a VIP client. And that presented a challenge to guys like Stephen Whitmore. Walter Harris changed his glasses at the front of the queue and looked down at the papers he was handling. He had completed what the bank needed. He was ready. But now Walter stood at the counter listening to the contemptuous attitude of the man in front of him and knew none of it counted. Senior manager Stephen Whitmore of the bank did not find a devoted client who had been making regular visits for decades. He saw not a man who had previously been a revered school teacher who had molded the brains of upcoming leaders. Not a number. He noticed an elderly man dragging the line with worn-out shoes and a cane. And that to him was unacceptable. Stephen responded, "Sir," exhaling hard as if Walter were personally spoiling his day. "As I've explained, you need to handle withdrawals like this online. We have policies, and we can't bend them just because you don't understand technology." Walter tightened a bit tighter grasp on his cane. His voice calm but forceful, he added, "I'm not asking for special treatment. I basically need access to my own money." Stephen rolled his eyes, then slanted slightly over the counter. "Then you should have worked out how to use the ATM before coming inside," he advised. A few patrons from surrounding laughed softly. Walter's jaw closed. His granddaughter's small hand was tightly grasping his own, her fingers so minuscule. 10 years old, Clara had tagged along today. Helping her grandfather had made her so happy, so eager to feel significant, to be a part of his day. And then now, she was seeing her hero degraded right now. Whispering, Clara looked up at Grandpa. "Are us in trouble?" Walter shook his head and tried a comforting grin. "No, sweetheart," he said in whispers. "We are not in peril." But the reality? He felt just as I did, because this now encompassed more than just a bank transaction. This reflected how the world now regarded him, how it treated individuals like him, people who had worked their whole lives only to be considered as liabilities the moment they slowed down. Stephen grinned, obviously savoring his power. "Sir, I have other customers who really belong here. I have not time for this." The words delivered like a slap. Walter briefly thought about going away. Let it slip. Yet then, like a thunderclap, a voice, calm but shockingly strong, breaks the stress. "That's an interesting approach to handle a consumer right now." The whole bank lobby stopped talking. Heads shifted, and Morgan Freeman stood there observing everything come together. Stephen ceased. His confidence faltered, so unflinching just moments ago. Given Morgan Freeman was not any ordinary client. He was not only some observer, he was in front of us. The type of man Abel can command a room without calling for attention. The kind of man who might cause even the most haughtiness to second-guess their behavior. Right now as well. Morgan Freeman was squarely staring at him. With a smooth, leisurely voice, Morgan remarked, "Is this how you usually do business?" Stephen choked and looked about the lobby as whispers floated through. Mr. Freeman, I didn't realize you were here," he stammered. Morgan asked an eyebrow, "And that matters. Why?" When Stephen opened his mouth, nothing came out. Since the truth was, it makes no difference. Morgan moved in closer, his hands sloppily in his pockets, his voice firm yet directive. "Help me understand something," he said. "This man here is a customer, isn't he?" Stephen hesitated, then gave a stiff nod. "True, but—" "And a lifetime client, if accurate?" Yet another nod. Lining in just little, Morgan asked, "So tell me, why is he being treated like an inconvenience?" Stephen reddened in front of her. He could feel the weight of the room down on him for the first time. He could feel the change, the quiet assessment from the very people who, only a moment earlier, had been too terrified to voice up. Right now? Right now they were observing him. One waits, anticipating a reply. Stephen started to cough and battled to get under control. "Look, just following policy. It's not personal." Morgan shook his head and laughed quietly. "But it is, really." He waved toward Walter, who was still silently clutching his paperwork. "Because of him, this is a moment rather than merely a transaction, and moments like these." Morgan focused his gaze on Stephen's. "There define you." There was a great stillness over the lobby. Stephen let out a sharp breath, moving foot to foot. He looked at Walter properly for the first time, not as an annoyance, but as a man who had lived long enough to merit more than this. Stephen drew a breath. Then, at last, he motioned toward Emily, the anxious bank teller. "Process his transaction," he continued, his voice soft now. Emily's eyes grew wide, then she nodded fast and went to the counter. Walter hesitated, then looked at Morgan. Morgan smiled. "Go ahead, Mr. Harris," he urged. "Let's conclude what you came here for." Walter cleared forward. Clara shot him a brilliant smile. And in that instant as well, he felt more than just a client collecting money. He thought of a guy reclaiming his dignity. For years, Stephen Whitmore had believed that status defined power. But he was going to discover today that actual power It originates from respect. Also Morgan Freeman? He was about to ensure that lesson lasted a lifetime. Still stood the whole bank lobby. The conflict loomed large in the air, an invisible force transforming an ordinary transaction into a confrontation about dignity, respect, and power. Once so certain of his power, Stephen Whitmore now stood stiff, his confidence rocked by Morgan Freeman's relentless stare. And Walter Harris? He wasn't the one feeling small for the first time in a very long time. Stephen changed his tie in an attempt to control things, starting with a smile. "Mr. Freeman," he said, "I can assure you this is just a misunderstanding. Bank policies exist for a reason." Morgan bent his head slightly, his face insensible. "And exactly what policy says a loyal customer deserves to be spoken to like he's wasting your time?" Stephen drank and looked about the room. Now eyes were on him, not with respect, but with examination. The same clients who had turned away Walter were now staring intently, their attitudes moving from apathetic to subdued judgment. Desperate to turn the conversation, Stephen cleared his throat, though his voice lacked the assurance it had earlier. I wasn't trying to be rude," he said. "It's just that—" "No excuses," Morgan said, his voice cool but bearing weight from experience. "Respect isn't something you give only when it's handy." The bank rippled with a low whisper, her fingers still lingering over the keyboard. Emily, the young teller who had been too terrified to speak up before, straightened slightly at her workstation. Walter's granddaughter, Clara, grabbed his hand and had bewildering innocent eyes. She arrived today thinking the world was fair and that adults were decent. Now, too, she was discovering that occasionally people in positions of authority would exploit their positions to make others feel inadequate. But today she was also picking knowledge another way, that none of them remained mute. Morgan moved slowly forward, his presence alone giving more power than any title on a nameplate could possibly demand. "I have visited many rooms like this," he remarked, his voice calm yet forceful. "Rooms where people judge a man's value by the weight of his wallet instead of his character." He looked at Walter, then turned back toward Stephen. "But I have also learned something else." Drawn into the cadence of his words, the whole room appeared to tilt in. "The actual measure of power is not found in the numbers on a bank statement." Stephen moved uneasily, but Morgan was not done. "It's in how you handle the folks who can do nothing for you." Silence descended, the kind of silence that causes one to consider every decision they have ever taken. Stephen exhaled sharply, his customary conceit breaking under the weight of the occasion. He had thought for years that his position entitled him to choose who mattered and who did not. Convinced that they weren't worth anyone's time, he had thrown aside people like Walter without thinking twice. But today, now, he was the one being examination. And for the first time he disliked how it felt. His voice missing the customary disdain, he turned to Walter. "Mr. Harris," he replied slowly, I apologize if I came off as unprofessional." Walter regarded him closely, his shrewd eyes full of something Stephen never expected. Not resentment nor wrath, just silent disappointment. And in some sense, that was worse. Morgan moved forward, softly lowering his voice to create more intimacy. "Apologies are easy," he remarked. "Change is hardest." Stephen drew a long breath, his hands closing at his sides. He felt the eyes fixed on him, not only Morgan's but also other, not only Walter's but also yours, but every banker who had formerly considered him as an untouchable authority. And nowadays, now everyone were waiting to see whether he would have the guts to own his error. He glanced at the young teller Emily, subsequently at Walter, then at Clara, the small child who had seen this entire thing happen, savoring every moment as though it were the first meaningful lesson in life. And Stephen knew at that same instant. This marked his crossroads. His voice now softer, he replied, "Mr. Harris, if you will allow me, I would want to personally make sure your transaction is handled properly." Walter blinks, surprised. "That would be appreciated," he stated simply. Stephen moved to Emily. "Process his request," he instructed. Emily hesitated because she had never heard Dad issue such a directive before, not because she didn't want to. She nodded slowly, then started typing. Walter closed his transaction a minute later. Handy money. Integrity whole. Though Morgan Freeman grinned, his comments had weight. Respect is not about policies or procedures, you see. He turned to face the chamber. It's about remembering that the guy in front of you is a human being. He turned to check on Stephen. And you never too late to start treating them like one. Stephen nodded slowly, the entire weight of the lesson at last registering. Morgan turned then to Walter and Clara. "Shall we get out of here?" he softly said. Grinning and pulling on Walter's sleeve, Clara said, "Let's go, Grandpa." Walter grinned and nodded. The whole bank lobby watched in quiet as they headed toward the exit. "Also, Stephen," he let them continue without stopping. He did not endeavor to reestablish his power. He just stood there, recognizing that today had transformed him in a way he never would have predicted. For years, Stephen Whitmore had believed that status defined power. But he discovered today that actual power, it results from respect. And then Morgan Freeman. He was about to make sure that lesson would endure a lifetime. Inside Whitmore Banking and Trust, the air had changed. Once there had been arrogant indifference, there was now uncomfortable quiet. Once a man who had spent years thinking power came from prestige and control, Stephen Whitmore now stood in the very middle of a moment that would define him, not just as a banker but as a person. He had blundered, one error that everyone had seen. And the worst aspect is also Morgan Freeman still had not finished with him. Stephen opened his throat and tapped nervously at the counter with his fingers. He had already done the toughest part, at least in some modest sense, admitting his mistake. Still now, though, he now had to evidence it. With great care, he said, "Mr. Harris, I'd want to personally ensure that any future transactions you need to make at this bank are handled smoothly. If you ever have any issues, you can come directly to me." Walter Harris stared at him, his wise old eyes ablaze with something unanticipated. Pity. "Mr. Whitmore," he responded, his voice steady but forceful, "I don't need special treatment. I don't VIP service. All I needed today was the same respect you would give any other client." A small number of patrons in the backdrop whispered in unison. Stephen felt his tummy becoming tight. Giving Walter a direct line to him would solve all, he had thought. Walter, however, desired something else entirely. Walter refused to grant an exemption. He craved equality, and therefore, Stephen had not really given that any thought previously. At last, Morgan Freeman, who had been a quiet but strong presence, spoke. "You see, Mr. Whitmore," he replied, his voice cool but with an unquestionable weight, "it's not about making one man feel important. It's about making sure no one ever feels unimportant again." Stephen mumbled. Morgan was not only expecting him to fix one error, he was urging him to conduct business totally differently. For a man like Stephen, that was no meager demand. But he understood something as he looked about. At Walter, at Clara, at the tellers who had once been too terrified to speak, and the clients who were now silently evaluating him. Should he fail to alter this moment? It would be with him always. Stephen nodded after a slow inhaled. He nodded and said, "You're right." Saying the words out seemed unusual, foreign almost. His entire career he had been convinced that power meant never having to back off. These days, though? Now he realized that understanding when to own your mistakes was the essence of real power. He turned to Emily, the young bank teller, who had been staring wide openly as all of this happened. "Emily," he added, "you help any customer, especially an elderly one, from now on, no matter how long it takes." Shocked, Emily blinked, her voice hardly above a whisper. "Yes, sir," she said. Stephen turned to Walter once more. "And Mr. Harris," he said, "you have my word that none will ever treat you like this again in my bank." Walter gave a little approving nod after closely examining him. It was not atonement, But that was only a beginning. Morgan grinned faintly, as if he had known all along that this was how things would end. He looked at Walter and Clara. "Well, Mr. Harris," he remarked cordially, "I believe we have a day to get back to." Clara beamed up at him, her small hand still hanging firmly to Walter's. "Mr. Freeman," she replied, her voice filled with admiration, "are you really the guy from all the movies?" Morgan chuckled. "I suppose I am," he responded. She started to smile more broadly. "Grandpa says you are the smartest man on TV." Walter laughed, shook his head. With a glitter in his eye, Morgan said, "Well, I don't know about smartest, but we have to start by being better to each other if we want the world to be better." Clara nodded like she were learning every word by heart. "Also, Stephen?" He silent, because for the first time in his life, he was finally listening. Walter and Clara proceeded toward the exit, Walter standing a little taller than previously. He had come in today feeling little. He was departing knowing his worth had never changed. Morgan followed them toward the door, but before he left, he turned back to Stephen one last time. "One last thing, Mr. Whitmore," he said. Stephen looked up, wary but attentive. "You thought today was just another day at work," Morgan continued, his voice soft but firm. "But today was the day you decided who you really are." Stephen exhaled, his expression incomprehensible. Morgan gave him a final nod, a silent but powerful acknowledgement before stepping out into the afternoon sunlight. And the environment inside Whitmore Banking and Trust changed behind him as the bank doors closed. It never would be exactly the same once more. Stephen Whitmore has developed his profession thinking of power as derived from control, but he discovered today that actual power, it emanates from respect. And Morgan Freeman? He made sure that lesson would endure a lifetime. Stephen Whitmore watched as Walter Harris and his granddaughter Clara stepped out of the bank, walking side by side. The man he had once dismissed as insignificant now felt like the most important person in the room. Also Stephen. He was left standing behind the counter for the first time in his career, truly questioning himself. He had spent years believing that success was judged by efficiency, by regulations, by the capacity to keep things going without disruption. But today he had learned that success wasn't just about transactions and numbers. It was about people. It was about seeing them, appreciating them, and recognizing that no amount of money could ever replace human dignity. He let out a deep breath, turning to his employees, the very individuals who had observed him at his lowest moment. "This bank will serve every customer with the respect they deserve," he stated, his voice softer but more real than it had been in years. "No exceptions." Emily, the young teller, smiled for the first time that day, a faint flash of hope in her eyes. Stephen turned to face the door where Morgan Freeman had just emerged into afternoon illumination. He gave a quick thought about calling after him. But then, what would he say? "Thank you for exposing my flaws. Thank you for making me see my own arrogance." Instead, he just watched as the guy who had just changed everything walked away, knowing he had done what he came to accomplish. And Stephen, he had been left with something far more valuable than money or status: a chance to be better. Through this story, we discover that true respect isn't dictated by riches, social rank, or material possessions. It is acquired through kindness, humility, and the way we treat others. Walter Harris may have walked into that bank as just another elderly customer, but by the time he left, he had reminded everyone that dignity is not something that can be denied. Stephen Whitmore realized today that real power comes from compassion, yet years he thought that strength stemmed from control. Morgan Freeman didn't demand change, he inspired it. Respect is something to be given freely. It is not something to be rationed. Judging someone by their appearance just exposes your own flaws. The best leaders are those who raise others up rather than those who criticize them. Money fades at the end of the day, titles change, but our treatment of people defines everything else. That is the kind of lasting quality